In a small village in the Niger Delta, Christmas was always a season of joy and celebration. Tejiri and Akpos, two bright and playful siblings, lived with their mother, Mrs. Ejiro. The children loved Christmas, the carols, the fireworks, and the cheerful spirit that filled the air. But their mother had one strict rule: they were never to accept gifts or food from anyone without her permission. Mrs. Ejiro was a hardworking widow. She had raised Tejiri, who was 12, and Akpos, who was 10, to be disciplined and smart. Everyone in the village admired the siblings for their intelligence and good manners. However, one woman, Mrs. Tegolo, secretly resented them. She envied their brilliance and often murmured, "Why should they shine when my children struggle?" Mrs. Tegolo was known for her cunning ways. Some villagers whispered that she dabbled in dark practices. She kept to herself most of the time, but her envy of Tejiri and Akpos grew with each passing day. She waited for the perfect moment to carry out her wicked plan. On Christmas morning, Tejiri and Akpos woke up excited. But the day started on a disappointing note when Mrs. Ejiro announced that there wouldn't be any special Christmas meal. Times were hard, and she had barely enough to make a simple meal. The siblings, though disappointed, decided to make the best of the day. As the sun rose higher, Tejiri had an idea. "Let's go around the village and greet people. Maybe they'll give us something to celebrate Christmas," she suggested. Akpos hesitated. He remembered their mother's warning. But Tejiri assured him, "We'll just greet them. We won't take anything unless it's really necessary." The siblings visited house after house. Many families welcomed them warmly, offering them food and small cash gifts. Tejiri and Akpos, in their excitement, began to forget their mother's instructions. "It's just Christmas," Akpos said, pocketing a few naira notes from a neighbor. Eventually, they arrived at Mrs. Tegolo's house. Her compound was eerily quiet. She sat on her veranda, peeling yams, and smiled warmly when she saw them. "Tejiri, Akpos, Merry Christmas. Come in," she called. The siblings hesitated. Something about Mrs. Tegolo's smile didn't feel right. But their hunger and curiosity got the better of them. They stepped into her house, where a table was set with a steaming bowl of owo soup and a mound of starch. The aroma was irresistible. "Eat, my children," Mrs. Tegolo said, placing the bowl and starch in front of them. "Christmas is for sharing." Tejiri and Akpos hesitated briefly but soon began to eat. Mrs. Tegolo handed them an envelope. "Take this money. Buy yourself something nice." By the time they returned home, Tejiri and Akpos felt strange. Their heads ached, and they could hardly keep their eyes open. Mrs. Ejiro immediately sensed something was wrong. "Where have you two been? What did you eat?" she asked sternly. Tejiri and Akpos avoided her gaze. They mumbled about visiting neighbors but said nothing about Mrs. Tegolo. That night, both siblings had vivid nightmares. In their dreams, they were trapped in a dark forest, surrounded by eerie laughter. The next day, their behavior began to change. Tejiri, who was once cheerful and polite, became rude and secretive. Akpos, who loved helping his mother, now avoided chores and spent hours staring blankly at the wall. Mrs. Ejiro was deeply worried. Days turned into weeks, and the children's condition worsened. They fought constantly, refused to go to school, and seemed to lose interest in everything they once loved. Mrs. Ejiro knew this wasn't normal. She prayed fervently, asking God for guidance. One night, a neighbor visited Mrs. Ejiro and shared a troubling story. "I saw your children at Mrs. Tegolo's house on Christmas Day," she said. "Be careful with that woman. People say she uses dark powers." Alarmed, Mrs. Ejiro confronted Tejiri and Akpos. When they finally admitted to visiting Mrs. Tegolo, Mrs. Ejiro's heart sank. She realized her children had disobeyed her warning and fallen into a trap. Determined to save her children, Mrs. Ejiro sought help from Pastor Emmanuel, a respected man of God in the village. The pastor listened carefully and agreed to pray for the family. "But first, you must confront Mrs. Tegolo," he said. Early the next morning, Mrs. Ejiro marched to Mrs. Tegolo's house. "What have you done to my children?" she demanded. Mrs. Tegolo feigned innocence, but her smirk gave her away. "Your children came to me willingly. They took my food and my money." Mrs. Ejiro refused to be intimidated. "Whatever evil you've done, it will not stand," she declared. She returned home and gathered her church members for a night of prayer and fasting. They prayed fervently, asking God to break every chain holding Tejiri and Akpos. That night, something miraculous happened. Tejiri and Akpos both woke up screaming, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. They cried and hugged their mother, apologizing for their disobedience. The next morning, they confessed everything. They told their mother how Mrs. Tegolo had given them owo soup, starch, and money, and how their behavior had changed since then. Mrs. Ejiro forgave them but reminded them of the importance of obedience and caution. News of the incident spread through the village. Many people were shocked and began to avoid Mrs. Tegolo. Some even accused her openly of wickedness. But Mrs. Ejiro chose to focus on her children's recovery. Over time, Tejiri and Akpos returned to their old selves. They became more disciplined and cautious, always remembering the lesson they had learned. "We'll never disobey you again, Mama," they promised. Mrs. Ejiro, grateful for the second chance, taught her children the importance of faith, obedience, and discernment. She also warned other parents to be vigilant about where their children went and what they accepted from others. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tegolo's influence in the village dwindled. Her once busy compound became deserted, and she retreated further into isolation. Some said she had been defeated by the prayers of Mrs. Ejiro and her church. The experience left a lasting impact on Tejiri and Akpos. They grew up to be strong, wise, and compassionate individuals, always willing to share their story to help others learn. Every Christmas, they would sit with their mother and recount the events of that fateful day. "It was a hard lesson, but it made us better," Tejiri would say. Akpos would nod, adding, "Christmas is about love and gratitude, not greed." The villagers, inspired by the story, became more united. They began to look out for one another, ensuring that no child was left vulnerable. The spirit of Christmas in the village became even more vibrant and meaningful.